something, it won't just sound like a bunch of other stuff you already heard. And that's nice. But anyway, the book that we're promoting tonight is called Cabin in the City. It looks like this. It's just some essays, kind of short ones, I must say. If you've ever read or tried to read any of my earlier books, there's less quotations from Aristotle and Hegel, but not totally removed. But I kind of try to cut it down a little bit. Actually, it's a problem that I have when people, like for example, you're at the dentist and you're getting your teeth cleaned, and you just chit chat a little bit, and you tell the gal that you wrote some books, and then she says, "Oh, what are they about?" Well, like if I wrote a book about submarine warfare in World War II, well then I could just tell her. Or, but I sit there thinking, well, what is this really? What is this about? So the book is about living in a house. It's about going on trips from the house, and it's a collection of things that, and among them, I'll just mention a few. There's essays about snowy owl, pea soup, kite flying, the history of agriculture, the linden tree in our front yard, washing windows, the joy of compost, prom night, and wood ticks, for example. So a lot of stuff going on in there. But I think I should start off by just reading the introduction right from the book, because it's kind of short, and this is what I said it was about, so I'm going to read it. It'll kind of help you a little bit. This collection takes its title from the introductory essay in which I describe the woodsy house where my wife Hillary and I have lived for more than 30 years. A few of the subsequent essays, which were written sporadically, concern themselves with everyday events at home and the natural surroundings of the place, which sits near a parkland corridor running for several miles on the western edge of Minneapolis. The trees, the passing deer, who enjoy the shrubbery even more than we do, and occasionally bed down for the night in the backyard, the sky, the passing seasons, the sounds of the night, and especially the birds. At a time when the pandemic has kept us at home perhaps more than we'd like, it's a pleasure and a gift to reflect on such agreeable critters and surroundings. Then again, more than a few of the essays focus on the city rather than the cabin, recounting forays into town to galleries, shops, parks, and an occasional restaurant, some of which I'm sorry to report have by now gone out of business, moved, or burned down. Yeah. You'll notice that books also figure prominently in a few of the pieces. I'm not a book hound, but I am a reader of sorts, and I've made my living in the book industry for half a century and more. Rereading this collection, I find that the French philosopher Gabriel Marcel and the English essayist Sir Thomas Browne pop up more often than I can actually explain, except to say that they write the kind of book that I reach for when I'm in a meditative mood. Social events, family and friends figure in several essays, as does the preparing and eating of food, especially vegetables, which provide yet one more means of letting the outside in. You'll come upon a few road trips and a few midsummer parties. I've arranged the pieces by season so as to avoid the odd juxtaposition of an ice dam and a hollyhock, for example. But they're not strictly chronological. Call it the good life. It's a hodgepodge of incidental reflections, modest in range, breezy in tone, with no unifying feature in the end, other than an interest in sharing the poetry that often animates the passing days. I'd like to thank the bookstore for hosting this event, and I'd like to thank the publisher, Norton Stillman, for agreeing to publish it. He's right there in the back. I'd like to thank my editor, Hillary Toren, who's right here. She does a very good job of encouraging me when she likes a piece and letting me know when something that I think is really funny is really not very funny. But even beyond that, she shares all the adventures that are in the book. So that's a huge dimension that gets mentioned often within these essays, but not as much as the reality. So actually, the first real little essay I'm going to read is kind of the one that gave the title to the book, and it describes how we happen to move into this house where we live. Probably about half the people in this room have been over there. But I don't know if everyone knows this story. And all the rest of you, you're invited over on Saturday at 10. Okay, here we go. I haven't, this is edited and shortened, but it'll still seem kind of long, maybe, I don't know. I haven't left the house in days except to shovel the driveway, refill the bird feeder, and deposit the container of vegetable peelings onto the compost pile out back. During these snowy stretches, when the evening commute becomes treacherous and outstate travel positively reckless, I count my blessings in A, not having to commute at all, that's because I work at home, and B, feeling no great need to leave town. The other afternoon, I was sitting on the couch with a pile of books beside me, watching the sun go down while the fire from a single log roared in the yodel stove. We were listening to a brand new CD of piano music by Sibelius. I might describe it superficially as a cross between Grieg and Sanson. Hillary had brought home some fresh walleye from the supermarket and potatoes. When the recital was over, we queued it up again. Yes, there are advantages to having a cabin in the city. That is to say, of having a home in the city that has a woodsy feel. Among other virtues, inhabiting such a dwelling obviates the long drive from the city to your lakeside retreat. It also eliminates the toil and expense of maintaining two domiciles. Of course, the signal purpose of owning a cabin or a summer place for many is to make it possible to exchange at will the noise and clutter of city life for the simplicity and quiet of the woods. It follows, therefore, that an urban home must, before all else, be woodsy and quiet to deserve consideration as a cabin. I wouldn't say when I started using the term cabin in the city, but I suspect it was during one of those informal tours people give to guests who are visiting for the first time. Passing through the conventional living room and the modest kitchen, we would reach the more unusual dining room, a later addition set at a 45-degree angle to the rest of the house, with a 12-foot ceiling and tall windows looking out toward the backyard. Visitors would look out through the windows to the broad deck, the narrow sward of grass below, and the woods beyond. From that point, I would direct their attention to the left, where a new room had just come into view, doubling back toward the front of the house. A previous owner, back in the 1950s, I guess, converted the breezeway between the house and the garage into a relatively spacious room paneled in knotty pine, with that small Swedish stove I mentioned jutting out into the middle of it. A pair of antique Ojibwe snowshoes now leans against the brick wall behind the stove, and some faded mallard decoys sit on the ledge on top. We call this our cabin in the city, I might have said, on the occasion of that now long forgotten tour. I was joking, of course, but over time, the underlying truth of the remark began to sink in. There isn't a lake anywhere nearby, and the woods out back is only 20 feet thick at best. We could probably name the individual trees. But the room has the feel of a cabin, and the house itself, though surrounded on every side by other smallish, one-story, post-war ramblers of similar construction, is only one strip of housing away from an extensive woods, running down a steep hill to a marsh, a creek, and a far larger chunk of undeveloped land that continues south for several miles through Theodore Park and the Minneapolis chain of lakes to Minnehaha Creek. A lot of you are familiar with that territory, I'm sure. That might explain why deer often pass through the yard and sometimes spend the night, why we hear owls hooting every winter and sometimes find them perched in the yard, why a beautiful fox passes through on odd occasions, and so on. Just today we almost ran into a coyote running across Golden Valley Road. This is common suburban stuff, I know, but it keeps us looking out the windows in every season, taking walks around the block, biking down Worth Parkway to Cedar Lake and beyond, feeding the backyard birds, and listening for the high-pitched keen of the local cooper's hawk. Light flows into the house at every hour of the day. We often sit in the living room and watch the sun come up, and cook dinner with the pink spread of sunset above the backyard woods, just outside the dining room windows. How we happened to arrive here is a story in itself. After spending 7 years on Grand Avenue in South Minneapolis, a major bus route with houses built unusually close to the street, we decided the time had come to start looking for someplace knew to live. I say we, but it was Hillary who initiated the search. She hired a realtor named Pat, who showed us quite a number of dwellings in several parts of South Minneapolis. We were still committed city dwellers, but none of them in our price range were much better than what we already had. In exasperation, Pat asked if there were any other neighborhoods we'd like to investigate. At that moment, something came to mind. A few years earlier, we'd been invited to a birthday party of a friend of a friend, a woman we didn't know well. It was a joint party, however, 2 birthdays, and it was being held at the other birthday girl's house in Golden Valley. As we zigged and zagged the final few blocks to that event, I remember saying to myself, why would anyone live way out here? But the house was nice. There were some woods out back. I even got the impression there was a stream off in the distance, though I couldn't see it. A week later, on a hot summer night, Pat took us around to a succession of smaller ramblers, trim but uniformly undistinguished, all within a few blocks of one another. The last one on the list looked much the same. When I walked in the door, I noticed that the house extended much further back than you might have guessed from the street. As we walked toward the back, we entered a room bent at an angle with tall windows looking out onto the deck. When I saw the 2 short steps down from the dining room to the den, I had one of those deja vu experiences that's both pleasant and creepy. It wasn't just that the house was as nice as the one we visited years ago. It was the same house. Hillary had recognized it the moment we walked in the door. Of course, we had to buy it. When the man we bought it from gave us a house tour, he spent less time discussing the virtues of the plumbing than identifying the various trees he planted in the yard. It might be worth mentioning that he held an executive position in the local nature conservancy. There was a Harrelson apple tree and a rare American chestnut in the front yard, and a row of rotund juniper trees formed a privacy screen along the north border in the back, echoing an even more impressive row of blue spruce through the south. The owner and his wife, an environmental lobbyist, had planted a mountain ash, a Russian olive, and a row of gray dogwoods along the edge of the deck. They also maintained a handsome vegetable garden in the back, with a pin oak nearby and a buckeye flourishing at the edge of the woods. They planted the terrace garden under the bedroom windows with wildflowers, wild geraniums, wild honeysuckle, and golden Alexander come to mind. And they put down trillium, hepatica, and Dutchman's breeches in the shadows of the little woods. The yard is a lot shadier now than it was 30 years ago, and many of the plants I just mentioned are gone, but we've replaced them with other things, and we've also nurtured quite a few of the volunteers that have drifted in over the years. One obvious drawback of owning a cabin in the city is that you have nowhere to escape to when the rat race starts getting you down. As readers of these essays will see, Hillary and I often head off for a few days and sometimes return to the same resort, even the same cabin, year after year. In time, a familiarity and hominess begins to settle in. I admit this coziness will never approach the feel of a family cabin with its layered, multi-generational history, but it will also be free of such chores as retrieving the dock that floats away with the ice every spring, removing dead pine needles from between the shingles on the roof, and keeping the gas line to the antique propane refrigerator in good repair. Well, you know what they say, you can't have everything. So that's just kind of like a little backstory. And now I'd like, does anyone have any questions? Because feel free. This is a nice little short one, and I thought I'd read this as kind of a Borgesian experience, because this is a piece about doing readings at Majors and Quinn. Okay? It's called National Poetry Month. National Poetry Month, November. I know what you're going to say. Fake news. In fact, I'm simply making a modest proposal that Poetry Month be shifted from April, when there's already a good deal of poetry in the air, to November, when we could actually use a few blasts of it from the printed page. Isn't it true? New books of poetry appear in significant numbers at this time of year. There are authors and publishers hoping for sales from shoppers looking for something light and relatively inexpensive to get for Aunt Tilly, who is never going to make her way through the new biography of Ulysses Grant. Though she might enjoy the crisp and enigmatic new collection by Michael Dennis Brown. I'm not trying to suggest that poetry is invariably sweet, frivolous, and inconsequential. More often, people complain that poetry is unnecessarily difficult and bewildering. I would argue that whatever else it is, poetry is of the essence of life. It is never theoretical, never political, in my view, always actual. Description becomes speech, thought becomes drama. The unstated punchline of every poem is something on the order of, well, I'll be darned. Or, who would have thought it? There are times, however, when the latent drama of poetry is difficult to summon. The words lie flat on the page. The rhythm eludes us. We're wondering what the point is. November is also a time of poetry readings, as authors set up events to promote their new works. Hillary and I attended several last week. On Monday, Michael Dennis Brown read at Majorson Quinn from Chimes, his new collection of shorter poems. I am a happy man tonight, he said, and it was easy to see why. And those of you who know him or have ever heard him read know what a glorious voice. Anything he says sounds great. And when he said, I am a happy man tonight, he said, and it was easy to see why. His children were there, including his son, who flew in from California as a surprise. There were old friends like Louis Jenkins and Narita Dittberner-Jack, and new collaborators like composer David Evan Thomas and Noden Press publisher Norton Stillman. Michael told us stories about his father and mother, stories you won't find in the book. The poems in the collection are drawn from every phase in his career, and Michael was clearly relishing the return journey, though he also read one more recent bittersweet poem in which he imagines his family sitting around the fire at the cabin once he's gone. A few days later, we stopped in at Common Good Books to hear a trio of poets, Joyce Sutphin, Tim Nolan, and Sharon Schmielars, read from their books. Their styles could not have been more different. Joyce has a twinkly eye and a slow, soft delivery. Tim uses the blunt comedic approach to good effect. And Sharon reminded me of my high school English teacher, Mrs. Deutsch, a tall and stern but kindly woman with a bottle of bourbon in her desk, whose insights into literature went far beyond anything we could comprehend. Poems about cats, envelopes of time, a yellow teacup, an uncooperative alarm clock. It was a good mix. We ran into Mike Hazard and his wife Tressa on the street before the reading and had a pleasant chat. I get the impression that most of the people who attend these events know the artists on stage as friends, teachers, fellow travelers, but that's not a bad thing. Rather, it's a community get-together, made more interesting by the fact that the specific attendees who show up differ from event to event. To me, the important thing is to hear the words given a face and a voice, embodied in the delivery. New critics be damned. The tone of the accompanying banter also adds to the effect. When we got home from the event, I put Mike Hazard's recent book, The World Is Not Altogether Bad, and read a few poems to Hillary while she chopped some onions for the frozen pizza we were about to slip into the oven. Do you guys know who the new critics were? Who knows who the new critics were? I had this line here, new critics be damned. Well, in the 50s, everyone studied the modern poetry, which is a book by Robert Penn Warren and Cleance Brooks, okay? They were the new critics, and John Crowe Ransom was one. And their theory was that they were tired of reading about the biographies of poets, which could be interesting, but it really had no relevance to whether the poetry was any good or even what it meant. So the new critics said, let's just look at the poem. Let's not worry about all that other stuff. Well, whenever you go to a reading, you meet the guy who wrote the poem, and it's interesting. Then all of a sudden something that never came alive all of a sudden came alive, and sometimes you internalize that, and then you kind of appreciate it more. So, new critics be damned, Let's find out who these people are. Anyway, you probably didn't need that little explanation. They're still pretty good. Like John Crowe Ransom wrote a book called The World's Body, if you want to read a very interesting book of critical essays that everyone would enjoy. Sure. Okay, any questions or comments?
Who was that author?
John Crow Ransom. Actually, his poetry is quite good too. It's very, very formal. It even rhymes, but it's extremely thoughtful. Although he made one really big mistake, which is that he lived to a ripe old age and he decided to rewrite all of his poems. And he was the editor of the Kenyon Review for many years, so he published them all in there. And there's universal agreement that he ruined them all. So, if you get an edition of his works, don't get that one. Okay. I don't know. I read that one. Oh, here's one that's just on one sheet. How about that? And that's a winter thing. This will get us ready. According to I had a way of figuring out how long it takes. I calculated that I read 2.82 words per second on average. And so you just take the word count and then you divide it by the word. It should take 2 minutes. A gorgeous thaw. The sun came out after a blustery, rainy morning, and suddenly everyone was out on the street. I went out too, but only to hack down a few of the bushes under the windows outside the den. Hack down might not be the proper phrase to describe this delicate and artful process, by which I succeed in taming the 12-foot shrubs, forsythia, yellow-twig dogwood, and high-bush cranberry, that have thrived in the 6-foot space under those windows for 30-odd years. The theory is that if you cut back a shrub before the sap starts to run, adventitious buds will develop further down on the branches, and as it leaves out, the plant in question will become fuller and more shapely while also remaining shorter. Most years, I forget to do this. It takes a sunny Friday afternoon in mid-February when the temperature reaches 45 degrees to alert me to the task. Meanwhile, Hillary went out to the street to chat with the neighbors. Stefan was walking his son Logan, home from school. Brendan appeared from his garage to return a vase we'd given his wife, Sarah, with some flowers to cheer her up while she was convalescing from an operation. And Alice, who moved into the house next door only last October, joined the party because, why not? Hillary and I then set out for a brief stroll through the neighborhood. A pale moon was visible, but we saw no turkeys in the trees, no deer tracks in the vanishing snow. We were both reminded of the joy felt by children listening to the sound of water running down the street and into the storm sewer grates. You guys remember that? Isn't that cool? It excites the deepest recesses of one's being. We felt it ourselves. I found a twig and tossed it into the flow of meltwater, but it was too heavy, or the stream was too shallow, or the current too slow. A week ago, the temperature was 24 degrees below zero. At that time, we were 200 miles north of here, but still. Yet I have little doubt that it will snow again more than once before we emerge into summer's garden. But right now, the sunlight hits the trees in a celebratory way, and it almost seems that the earth is starting to breathe again. That's kind of like, in 4 or 5 months, we'll really enjoy that. Right now, we're still, haven't we had a wonderful fall?
Yeah.
But will we remember it? I mean, we remember the tornado of 1991, and we remember the Halloween blizzard, but the golden autumn of 2021, I don't know how we better hang on to that somehow. It's been wonderful.
John,
Yeah,
you have to write about it. Then we can.
I did write about it today.
There we go.
And that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, Herb, because a lot of these started their life as a blog. And so, they've been brushed up and shortened and added to sometimes. But blogs aren't very fashionable, I realize, but the neat thing about them is that you just, when you're thinking of something, then you put it down there and send it out. A few people may look at it, but then, it's down. And if you ever want to retrieve it, actually, the name of my blog is rather unusual. It's called Macaronic John. And I don't need to explain why, but it's something kind of handy about that, because it's such an unusual word, it's a hyphenated word. If I ever want to find something, like I'm thinking, I wrote something about Howard Hawks, couple, I can't remember where that was. If I just Google macaronic-John, Howard Hawks, there you go. Comes up, there it is. Just copy it off into a Word file or do whatever I want to. So, to all of you, it's free too, so if you feel like starting a blog, go for it. Or maybe how many people do a blog? Have ever done one? Nobody? Oh. Well, whatever. Okay, should I read one more thing?
Yeah.
Okay. I picked this one because it covers a lot of different things. Sometimes you'll find that if you happen to take a look at this book, that I kind of go from topic to topic. And I like to believe that there is some internal logic or coherence to it. So you be the judge. This is called Halcyon Days. The word for these, it's kind of appropriate, I didn't realize it. The word for these golden fall days is halcyon. And by the way, today I Googled the word halcyon to make sure I was pronouncing it right. Because I thought it was, but you don't usually use it in conversation very often. The colors of the changing leaves are magnificent and the temperature is perfect. Low 60s creeping improbably into the 70s from time to time with cooler nights. But how are we to respond? Each moment is perfection in itself. Why do anything? But we must do something. It's the motive for and definition of poetry, the intensification and exaltation of experience. I'm not a poet, so I spent the day Thursday repairing and regrading the window well behind the yew bushes, just outside our living room windows. All the while I was thinking to myself, I should be reading Sir Thomas Browne's Religio Medici. But first things first. I dug out, maybe I'll skip this part because this describes what I did, how I fixed it. The best thing was I bought a long drain pipe, and that's what really fixed it. They did a lot of other stuff too. The weather the next day was so inviting that Hillary and I drove down to Rice Lake State Park, one of the least celebrated parks in the state, though it's a mere 90 minutes from the Twin Cities. We camped, we hiked the perimeter of the park, past golden leaves and cattails rustling in the gusty wind. We ate chips and dip for dinner, washed it down with a bit of bad Sauvignon Blanc, then sat on our indispensable camp chairs looking up at the brilliant stars through the naked branches overhead, which were faintly lit by the flickering campfire. The Orionid meteor shower was at its peak, but we saw nothing along those lines. The next morning, I was awakened by a flash of lightning or the headlights of a passing car or a car passing by on the gravel loop road around the campsite. Thunder a few seconds later, then the rain arrived. 10 flurried minutes later, we were all packed up and snug inside the car, only half soaked ourselves, heading for Owatonna in the dark with the smell of wet manure from the nearby farm fields coursing through our nostrils. We ate breakfast at the kitchen in downtown Owatonna, bought a pumpkin in near darkness at the farmer's market in the town square, and stopped for another cup of coffee at a place called Goodbye Blue Monday Coffee House in downtown Northfield. Is any of you familiar with that? Yeah. Everyone goes, yeah, okay, good. The place was bubbling with activity. A large group of men sat around a long table near the front window. Closer to us, 5 young women were discussing an event they had all attended the previous evening, though I never gleaned what it was. The street outside was still fairly dark, but the long, warm room inside was well lit, colorful, and filled with animated chatter. A sort of ideal vision of funky intellectual stimulation and collegial Gemütlichkeit. I was only a little disappointed to discover that the women behind me were discussing not Hegelian dialectic, or even the novels of Doris Lessing, but their pets. One of them was trying to find someone, without quite asking outright, who would agree to give her $1 million cat shots twice a day while she was gone on a 4-day trip to America. There were no takers. Northfield was hosting its annual art crawl that morning. Before we left the house, I had printed out a map pinpointing the participating galleries and studios, but the event wasn't set to open until 10, and by that time, we were back home again, sitting comfortably in front of another, more robust fire. It was still drizzling, but I was pleased to note that not a single drop had penetrated the new window well in the basement. In the midst of this pleasant hookah, or higgy, or however you say it, the Finnish, no, it's Norwegian. Isn't it? Danish, okay, sorry about that, Jim. I turned finally to Religio Medici by Sir Thomas Browne, the English essayist whom I have been eager to get a handle on for some time. Here's a quote. Music unties the ligaments of my frame, takes me to pieces, dilates me out of myself, and by degrees, methinks, resolves me into heaven. Yes, music. I fetched my 12 CD collection of the keyboard works of William Byrd, the composer Browne himself might have listened to. Upon first listen years ago, I got the impression that this set was actually composed of a single CD reproduced 12 times. I am now convinced that a harpsichord does not sound exactly like a virginal or a musolar. There's a good deal of exploring still to do here. Meanwhile, here's another quote. I love to lose myself in a mystery, to pursue my reason to an o altitudo. 'Tis my solitary recreation to pose my apprehension with those involved enigmas and riddles of the Trinity, with incarnation and resurrection. I can answer all the objections of Satan and my rebellious reason with that odd resolution I learned from Tertullian, certum est qua impossible est. My Latin's not very good, but I'll tell you what that means. This is certain because it is impossible. That was Tertullian's famous defense of Christianity. Browne is sometimes referred to as the English Montaigne, but that French skeptic fueled his reflections on Horace and Ovid, while Browne seems more concerned to reconcile Christian doctrine with human reason, or at least to conjure how much of experience lies beyond reason's purview. The two writers share an easy command of prose, always curious, often bemused, never strident. Browne is credited with adding more than 100 new words to the English language that are still in use. Quite a few of his neologisms have since vanished from the lexicon too. Hence the need for the lengthy but easy to use set of notes in the back, which help us to figure out what, for example, disingenuous and improperations mean. One of Browne's favorite words is indifference, which she used to describe not the attitude we might have towards an idea or thing, but a point or issue that is not so important as to demand our assent. And indifference is a position that we can take or leave to suit our whimsy, or suspend judgment on altogether, entertaining it, as it were, while neither condemning it nor embracing it wholeheartedly. I can see why the term never caught on, though it seems to be a 17th century equivalent of our own whatever, or that immortal colloquialism we use to describe contending views that aren't really as rigorously opposed as we're being asked to believe. Same difference. Remember that? Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Well, that's probably plenty. Any questions or comments or witticisms, criticisms?
Your definition of poetry again, John? It was very nice.
Oh, it was actually I was kind of lifting that from Kenneth Rexron. It was the intensification and exaltation of experience.
Yeah, good.
That's a good definition.
I like it.
Yeah.
Do
Well,
you think you write something every day?
no, I don't. But pretty often. I kind of feel, like if I hadn't written some down for 3, 4, 5 days, I kind of feel like, we're doing other things. I write. I have journals that I write in. When we go up north, I don't bring a computer or anything. I just write stuff out longhand. And some of you probably notice that it just sounds different. You think a little different when you're writing longhand. But then other times I'll just sit down, like we'll go to a restaurant or something, and or take a walk, and then I'll just sit down and kind of type out some impressions. So often I write pretty often, but usually in little spurts. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. I think I've read a lot of different things, and so
Do you have a nightcap?
a little. Do I? Oh, maybe I do. Oh, this is a pretty good one. It is short. Well, it's not that short, but what I like about it is this is about economics, but trust me, it's not that bad. It's called Pea Soup. A hedge fund manager made headlines the other day for paying $285 million, or was it $385 million, for a half-finished apartment in Manhattan. But on a gray, slightly snowy day in January, it's hard to beat sitting in an overstuffed chair in front of the fire in a suburban rambler with a mug of split pea soup in one hand and a copy of Montaigne's essays in the other. The snow is so light you can shovel it with one arm, so it's easier with two. And birds seem to be arriving at the feeder from all over the neighborhood. Pileated, red-breasted, and downy woodpeckers, 5 or 6 cardinals at a time, shifting places or waiting their turn on the naked branches of the Amir maple tree near the fence. There's a frenzy in the air, and it's exciting to witness. I made the pea soup yesterday, and it taught me 2 lessons. The first is that green pea soup can be just as good as yellow pea soup. I'd been hung up on the French-Canadian yellow pea variety, but I couldn't find yellow peas at the grocery store. Also, number 2, in boiling up the green split peas, I noticed for the first time that they actually smell like fresh green peas. It's a nice summertime smell. You may not be aware that Minnesota is the nation's largest producer of green peas. Farmers here plant 90,000 acres a year, and the revenue they generate from this activity averages $38 million annually. This means that if all the pea farmers in Minnesota pooled their proceeds for 10 years, they too could buy a half-finished penthouse in Manhattan. Maybe they can set up a timeshare. Oh, here's the second thing I learned, which is that it's a good idea to, I should probably enter right there, but oh yeah. The second thing I learned is that it's a good idea to overload your pea soup with sauteed onions, celery, and carrots. Don't hold back. What else are you going to do with that celery anyway? Summer savory is a preferred herb, especially in Quebec. But go easy on the salt, because that big chunk of salt pork is going to have a profound effect on the flavor. At a certain point in the afternoon, it's a good idea to go out and get some air. Hillary and I drove down to the Lake Harriet Kite Festival, and we even brought along a kite I'd gotten recently as a birthday gift. In the end, we left the kite in the car, but it was fun to be out wandering on the ice with several hundred other winter enthusiasts. The display of airborne kites was not overwhelming. A few little dots of color here and there against the gray sky. Not only was the wind feeble, but the ice was covered with a thin veneer of loose snow, which made it difficult for kite flyers to run across the frozen lake at any great speed without taking a fall. An ice fishing contest had been organized for the kids. Several food trucks were parked in the lot near the band shell, and volunteers were dispensing free coffee to anyone who would make a contribution to the Art Shanty Villages, which lost out on their grant and will not be in operation this winter. This is a couple years ago. Just being out on the open expanse of a frozen lake with people passing this way and that in random directions, like a scene from Dr. Zhivago, is a thrill. You guys remember that one scene? Anyway, at one booth they were renting fat tire bikes, and we could see little squadrons of cyclists pedaling across the ice in the distance. All the way there and back on Worth Parkway, we listened to a mysterious CD called Praying that was recorded in a Norwegian church by Carl Ivar Restroff Trio. If you haven't heard of them, though, that's okay. We're talking here about a vibraphone, a double bass, and an alto saxophone, or occasionally a duduk, an ancient double reed wind instrument from Armenia made of apricot wood. Back home, I faced a challenge that no hedge fund manager will ever face. The fire had gone out while we were gone, but it was still smoldering. Some golden pieces of split cedar kindling were lying in a wicker basket on the hearth. I had split them myself from the butt end of a long cedar beam I'd been cherishing in the garage for years. I knew that if I tossed 1 or 2 of those pieces in, they would soon burst into flame and revive the fire. They would smell heavenly, burn perfectly, and crackle like nobody's business. So beautiful, so precious. But supplies are limited.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Great to see everybody.